long period of integration, deeper integration between Canada and the United States is over. 50% tariff on steel, 50% tariff on aluminum, 25% tariff on automobiles, all the tariffs on forest products. Those are more than irritants. Those are violations of our trade deal.
The U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos.
Alcohol, dairy, and energy, all three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA.
Washington handed Canada a list, 5 demands. All 5 covering sectors are worth a combined $960 billion in annual trade. The expectation was simple. Canada would negotiate, maybe concede 1 or 2. That's how these things usually go. But within 24 hours, Mark Carney had rejected every single one.
Our negotiations with the United States and how we diversify our partnerships elsewhere. We don't get up first thing in the morning. I do not get up first thing in the morning and think about the United States. Okay? I think about Canadians.
Not partially, not quietly, all 5 at once. And that decision just changed the math on the biggest trade relationship in the world. The demands came from US Trade Representative Jameson Greer, delivered directly to Congress as conditions for extending CUSMA, the trilateral trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, for another 16 years. The list covered dairy access, digital media platforms, government procurement, alcohol distribution, and energy. 5 sectors, 5 pressure points. Each one was chosen because Washington believed Canada couldn't afford to say no. What Washington miscalculated was the order of events. Before Greer stood before Congress, Canada had already passed legislation locking supply management permanently into law, already redirected $70 billion in federal procurement toward domestic suppliers, already opened alternative export channels. Start with energy, because everything else sits on top of it. The United States imports approximately 3.9 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every single day. That figure represents roughly 60% of all US crude imports. Gulf Coast refineries were specifically engineered to process Canadian heavy sour crude, meaning they can't simply switch suppliers without billions in retrofitting costs and years of lead time. Current AIR figures before publishing. During winter peaks, New England draws on Canadian electricity imports to keep the grid stable and homes heated. This isn't a trade relationship built on preference. It's built on infrastructure, on physical dependency that took decades to construct and cannot be unwound in a negotiating room. And yet energy wasn't framed as Washington's primary concern. That silence is a tell, because everyone in the room already knows who needs whom. Dairy was the most publicly argued demand. American producers have long targeted Canada's supply management system, which imposes tariffs between 200% and 298% on dairy imports beyond fixed quotas. Washington called it protectionism. Canada calls it stability, a system that protects thousands of farms concentrated heavily in Quebec from the volatility of open market competition. What changed this time is that Canada didn't just defend the policy in a press conference, it legislated it. Supply management is now structurally protected by law, effectively removing it from the negotiating table regardless of what Ottawa might want to offer. The digital media dispute follows the same logic. Canada's streaming and online news legislation forces platforms like Netflix and Spotify to reinvest Canadian revenue into local content. Washington called it discrimination. Canada called it survival, sitting next to the world's largest media machine. The procurement demand collapsed under its own weight almost immediately. Washington demanded equal access for American companies in Canadian provincial contracts. The problem? The United States enforces Buy American provisions across federal spending, military contracts, and infrastructure projects with strict domestic sourcing requirements. Carney's rejection here wasn't strategic. It was almost obligatory. The alcohol dispute is where the sequencing becomes impossible to ignore. Several Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine imports only after the US tariffs hit Canadian goods. Washington then demanded that those bans be lifted without removing its own tariffs first. That's not a negotiation. That's a demand for unilateral compliance while the original pressure stays in place. Canada declined. The most revealing part of Washington's demand list isn't what's on it, it's what isn't. Automobiles, the most economically integrated sector in the entire relationship, were conspicuously absent from the core demands. The reason is simple. Auto manufacturing across North America operates as a single system. Parts cross the Canada-US border multiple times before final assembly. Canadian factories produce components for American vehicles. US plants supply engines for Canadian production lines. Disrupting that network doesn't hurt Canada more than America. It hurts both equally, and American manufacturers have already made that clear to the administration directly. That silence around autos isn't diplomacy. It's Washington acknowledging, without saying it aloud, exactly where the limits of its own leverage end. While Washington was formalizing its demands, Carney was building outward. Targeted agreements with China reopened Canadian canola and agricultural export markets under what Ottawa described as friendly nation tariff terms. Not a full trade deal, but enough to reduce the directional dependency that defined decades of Canadian economic policy.